"That is forbidden," the Apache woman whispered, and the mountain man's realization shook the town. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of New Mexico's mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Elias Crow moved carefully along the rocky path that led through the canyon. His boots crunched over the dry stones, and the wind carried a faint scent of sagebrush and dust. He had been traveling these mountains for years, yet each day held something new. The land was alive, full of hidden streams, secret caves, and whispers of the past. Elias had always preferred the quiet of the wilderness to the chatter of the nearby town. People often called him a hermit, a man who kept to himself, and he did not mind. The mountains were enough company for him, though sometimes he wondered what it would be like to speak to someone who truly understood the land. He paused for a moment, adjusting the leather strap of his pack. His eyes scanned the canyon walls for any signs of movement, deer tracks, the glint of a hawk's eye, or perhaps a rattlesnake hiding among the rocks. Elias had learned to watch carefully. His life depended on it. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound almost like the rustle of leaves in a distant grove. He frowned and moved toward it, curious. That's when he saw her. She was crouched near a small pool of clear water, carefully gathering herbs from the rocky soil. Her movements were precise and deliberate, as if every motion had meaning. Elias froze for a moment, not wanting to startle her. He had never seen anyone else in this part of the canyon before. The woman wore a simple dress of earth-toned cloth, her long black hair braided neatly down her back. Her skin glowed softly in the late afternoon light, and her eyes, dark, deep, and steady, met his before she could even look away. "That is forbidden," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but firm, carrying across the canyon. Elias's eyes widened. He had not expected to hear words, especially not directed at him. "Forbidden?" he repeated, keeping his voice calm. "What do you mean?" The woman stood slowly, her gaze never leaving his. She pointed to a section of the canyon behind her, where a cluster of rocks formed a natural barrier around a small grove of trees. "You must not go there," she said. "It is sacred. It is not for strangers." Elias studied her for a moment. He had heard of the local Apache communities, but he had never interacted with anyone who still lived so closely with the old ways. "I didn't mean any harm," he said. "I was just exploring." The woman's expression softened slightly, though her eyes remained cautious. "Many who do not understand harm the land without knowing," she said, "even if they think they are careful." There was something in her voice that carried a warning beyond the words. It was not just about rocks or trees. It was about something much older, something that demanded respect. He nodded slowly. "I understand," he said.
"I will not go there."
The woman's shoulders relaxed, and she returned to her herbs. Elias watched her for a moment longer, fascinated. He wondered what she was gathering and why it mattered so much. He had spent years surviving in the wilderness, knowing how to hunt, fish, and navigate the mountains. But he had never encountered someone who seemed so connected to the land in a way that went beyond survival. For the next few days, Elias found himself returning to the canyon, not to intrude but out of curiosity. He would watch from a distance as the woman worked, noticing the care with which she handled each plant, each stone, each stream. She moved with a rhythm that seemed to belong to the land itself, as if she were part of its heartbeat. Sometimes she hummed quietly, a soft melody that carried through the canyon like a gentle wind. The townspeople had their own stories about the canyon, most of them exaggerated. They spoke of hidden treasures, lost gold, or cursed land. Elias had never paid much attention to the tales, but now he wondered if there might be some truth to them. not in the form of wealth, but in the deep respect the land demanded. He had always believed the mountains could teach him lessons, but he had not realized how much he still had to learn. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned a deep purple, Elias finally spoke to her. "You have lived here a long time?" he asked. She looked up, her eyes meeting his in the dimming light. "I have," she said. "I know this land because it is part of my family, my people, my past. You must learn to see it, not as something to take from, but as something to honor." Elias nodded, thinking about the hunters he had encountered in the past, men who had stripped the mountains of their resources without care. He realized that he had sometimes acted no differently, taking what he needed without fully understanding the consequences. There was a lesson here, one that he had never been taught in the town or in the wilderness schools he had attended. Over the next few weeks, their paths continued to cross. Elias learned small lessons from her without her ever giving a formal teaching. How to move silently over rocks so as not to disturb the small creatures that lived there. How to notice subtle changes in the wind and sky that hinted at rain or danger. How to treat water and plants with care, understanding that each was part of a delicate balance. But it was not just knowledge that fascinated him. It was her presence, calm yet firm, wise yet approachable. She seemed to know everything about the canyon, and yet she trusted him enough to allow him to witness it from a distance. He felt a growing respect, a quiet admiration that he had never felt for anyone before. One afternoon, Elias finally asked, "Why do you warn me? Why not let me explore?" She looked at him steadily. "Because some things are not for everyone," she said simply. "Some things, if disturbed, can bring harm. You may not understand now, but one day you will. And when that day comes, you will remember why it is forbidden." Elias thought about her words as he left the canyon that evening. The sky was painted with stars, and the air was crisp and cool. He felt a sense of wonder he had not felt in years, a feeling that the mountains were alive in ways he had never imagined. Her warning echoed in his mind. That is forbidden. He returned home to his cabin on the edge of the forest, sitting by the fire as the wind whispered through the trees. He could not stop thinking about the woman, about her connection to the land, and about the hidden truths the canyon held. He knew his life was about to change, though he did not yet understand how. Something in the mountains had shifted, and he was ready to follow, step by careful step, wherever it might lead. Elias fell asleep that night with a sense of anticipation, as though the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to discover the secrets it had guarded for generations. And somewhere in the canyon the woman continued her work, unaware that the quiet mountain man was about to embark on a journey that would not only change his life, but shake the town in ways no one could imagine. The days following Elias's first encounter with the Apache woman passed slowly, yet each one felt heavier with thought. He kept returning to the canyon, careful not to cross the boundaries she had spoken of. The phrase, "that is forbidden," lingered in his mind, twisting itself into questions he could not easily answer. Why was it forbidden? What was so important that even the wind itself seemed to respect it? Elias could not shake the feeling that the answers were waiting just beyond his reach, hidden within the rocks and shadows of the canyon. He tried to speak with townsfolk about it, but most of them dismissed the idea. Some laughed, saying the canyon held nothing but old stones and the occasional deer. Others spoke of treasures hidden by old settlers long gone, imagining gold or precious artifacts. Elias knew better than to believe in wild stories, yet he could not ignore the sense of weight, the quiet authority of the woman's words. There was truth in them, though it was buried beneath the dust of years. One afternoon, Elias spotted her again, kneeling beside a small stream, her hands carefully arranging stones along the water's edge. The sunlight glinted off her dark hair as she moved, and for a moment he felt a strange sense of calm, as if the world had slowed just for her. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her. "You return," she said, not looking up. Her tone was calm but carried a hint of warning. Yes," Elias replied. "I wanted to understand."
"I want to learn what you were talking about." She finally looked up, her eyes meeting his.
There was a glimmer of recognition, a spark that suggested she had seen this curiosity in others before, and perhaps in him as well. "Understanding comes slowly," she said. "Some lessons cannot be learned in one day. You must watch, listen, and wait." Elias nodded, his mind spinning with questions. "Can you teach me?" he asked quietly. The woman studied him for a long moment before speaking. "I do not teach for power or knowledge," she said. "I teach only for respect. The land, the water, the air, they do not belong to us. They belong to all who come after, and to those who came before. If you wish to learn, you must remember that first." Over the following weeks, Elias watched and followed her routines from a distance. He learned how she gathered herbs without damaging the surrounding plants, how she observed animal tracks to understand the flow of life in the canyon, and how she used small stones and sticks to test the strength of the soil. Every movement, every observation, carried a lesson, though it was subtle and easy to miss. Elias began to notice things he had never paid attention to before. The way a bird's flight could signal rain, the way leaves trembled slightly before the wind picked up, the subtle sound of water seeping through rocks that indicated a hidden spring. He realized that the land spoke a language he had never taken the time to hear. One day he gathered the courage to ask her about the sacred area she had warned him about. "Why is it forbidden?" he asked. "Is it dangerous?" The woman looked toward the grove, her eyes softening. "It is not dangerous in the way you imagine," she said. "It is dangerous to those who do not understand, to take without care, to disturb without thought. That brings harm. The land remembers, and it will respond." Elias frowned, trying to comprehend her words. "It remembers, yes," she said. "The mountains, the rivers, the stones, they all remember. And some memories are not meant to be forgotten." He fell silent, realizing that she was speaking not just about the physical dangers, but something deeper, a connection between life, respect, and history. He had hunted and explored for years, yet he had never considered that every step he took left an imprint, a trace of his presence in the world. As days turned into weeks, Elias began to feel a shift within himself. His usual confidence, his certainty about surviving in the wilderness, was being replaced by a cautious respect. He realized that knowledge alone was not enough. Understanding and humility mattered more. Every time he approached the forbidden area, he felt the weight of unseen eyes watching, as if the canyon itself reminded him to tread carefully. One evening, after a long day of observing the woman's work, Elias sat near his small fire and thought about the townspeople. Many of them would never understand the lessons she was teaching. They saw the canyon as a resource to be taken, a place of profit or excitement. Elias felt a growing responsibility, not only to learn these lessons for himself, but to protect what was sacred from those who did not respect it. A sudden noise snapped him from his thoughts. He turned toward the canyon, his hand instinctively reaching for the knife at his belt. A group of men from town were climbing over rocks near the sacred grove. They were laughing and speaking loudly, clearly unaware of the delicate balance they were disturbing. Elias's heart pounded. He had hoped to keep his distance, to observe and learn, but now he faced a choice. He could either confront them, risking anger and ridicule, or stay silent and watch the land be harmed. He remembered the woman's words, "It is dangerous to take without care." Taking action now was part of that lesson. He moved closer, keeping to the shadows, and called out, "Stop!"
"You don't know what you're doing." The men turned, surprised to see him. "Crow!"
"What are you doing here?" one of them asked, his voice mocking. "This is just some old rocks."
Nothing dangerous. Elias stepped forward, his eyes firm. "Those rocks, that grove, they are sacred. You don't belong here." The men laughed again, brushing off his words, but Elias did not back down. He explained what he had seen, what he had learned, and the warnings the woman had given him. His voice carried authority, not arrogance, and some of the men paused, uncertain. Though the confrontation ended without violence, Elias felt the tension in the air. The town had begun to ignore the sacredness of the land, and some would continue to do so no matter what he said. Yet he also felt a spark of hope. If he could understand, others might too. He realized that his journey was no longer just about survival. It was about bridging a gap between worlds, about teaching respect and awareness where there had been ignorance. That night, as Elias returned to his cabin, he thought about the woman in the canyon. He understood now that her warning was more than a rule. It was a test, a way to teach him humility and patience. "Some things are not for everyone," she had said, and he realized that part of being worthy of the canyon's secrets was learning restraint, respect, and careful observation. He spent hours by the fire replaying the day in his mind. The land had spoken to him, and he had begun to listen. He thought about the men from town, about how easily people could disrupt what they did not understand, and he resolved to do everything he could to protect it. Elias felt a strange sense of purpose, something he had never experienced in his solitary years in the mountains. The canyon was no longer just a place to wander and survive. It had become a teacher, a guide, and a responsibility. And somewhere, hidden among the rocks and herbs, the woman continued her work, unaware that her quiet lessons were already reshaping the mind and heart of a solitary mountain man. He lay down that night, listening to the wind through the trees and the distant call of a coyote. For the first time, he felt that he was not alone in the wilderness. There were forces, memories, and lives intertwined with every rock and stream, and he had a role to play. The canyon had become a living story, and he was beginning to understand the first chapters. And though he did not yet fully grasp all of its secrets, he knew one thing: he would return, he would learn, and he would protect. For the forbidden was not simply a warning. It was a promise of knowledge, respect, and a connection to the land that no one could take lightly. Elias woke early the next morning, the crisp mountain air filling his lungs. The events of the previous day lingered in his mind, replaying like a slow, tense echo. He had confronted the men from town near the sacred grove, and while nothing had broken, no trees, no rocks, no water had been harmed, it was clear to him that the threat remained. The canyon's fragile balance, the woman's warnings, and the hidden lessons of the land were at risk if people continued to ignore them. He packed a small bag, taking only what he needed: some dried meat, water, and a few tools. Today, he decided, he would go back to the town, not just as a solitary mountain man, but as someone who had seen the truth. He wanted to speak to the town council, to explain what he had witnessed, and perhaps to make them understand the importance of protecting the sacred land. As he walked through the familiar paths of the mountains, Elias thought about the woman He had not spoken to her about his plan, and he wondered how she might react. She had taught him patience, observation, and humility. Perhaps she would see this step as a sign that he had begun to understand the deeper meaning of her warnings. When he reached the edge of the town, the contrast was immediate. The simple buildings, dirt roads, and small shops felt loud and bustling compared to the quiet of the canyon. People called greetings, waved tools, or shouted instructions, moving quickly from place to place. Elias walked steadily toward the council hall, aware of every glance cast his way. Some looked curious, others skeptical, and a few openly amused. Inside the council hall, the atmosphere was heavy with the usual tension. Men and women gathered around the long wooden table, papers and ledgers spread before them. Elias stepped forward, removing his hat and placing it carefully under his arm. "Council members," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I have something important to report." The council members turned their attention to him, some raising eyebrows. "Crow," one man said, leaning back in his chair, "we've heard your stories about the canyon before. What is it this time?" "It's not a story," he said. "It's about the sacred grove near the canyon. I have seen men from town disturbing it. They do not understand the consequences of their actions, and the land will not forgive carelessness." A few members exchanged glances, some smirking. "Sacred grove?" one asked, clearly skeptical. "What are you talking about? That land has nothing in it but rocks and trees." Elias shook his head slowly. "It is more than rocks and trees. The land remembers what happens on it. Disturb it, and harm will come not just to the land, but to those who disrespect it. I have seen the consequences of carelessness already. Streams can dry, soil can weaken, and animals will disappear. The balance is delicate, and it must be protected." The council murmured among themselves. Some were nodding, curious, while others laughed quietly, dismissing his warning. One older man leaned forward, pointing a finger at Elias. "We've survived here for decades without sacred groves protecting us. Why should we listen to you?" Elias met his gaze steadily. "Because ignorance will not prevent harm. The canyon has its own rules, and they are not written in any book or law. I have learned them by watching, by listening. If we do not respect them, we risk losing something we cannot replace." A young council member, a woman with sharp eyes and a quiet voice, spoke up. "And how do you know this? You are only one man. You cannot speak for the land or its secrets." "I am not speaking for the land," Elias replied. "I am speaking for those who cannot. I have witnessed what happens when people cross the boundaries without care. I have seen how fragile it is, and I have been taught by someone who knows it better than any of us ever could. Her knowledge is old, and it is true." A few council members shifted uncomfortably. Some had seen changes in the canyon themselves, small landslides, disappearing water, unusual behavior in the animals, but they had dismissed them as accidents or natural occurrences. Elias's words made them reconsider. "I suggest," he continued, "that we take steps to protect the sacred grove, limit access, mark boundaries, and educate those who enter. It is not a question of superstition. It is a matter of survival and respect." For a moment, the room fell silent. The tension was palpable. Then one of the men who had mocked him earlier spoke, his tone sharp. "And what if we don't? What happens then?" Elias met his eyes without flinching. "Then the canyon will respond. Sooner or later, the consequences will reach you. It has a memory, and it does not forget." There was an uncomfortable pause. Some council members looked at the floor, avoiding his gaze, while others whispered among themselves. A few nodded slowly, beginning to understand that this was not mere superstition. It was knowledge earned through observation, respect, and patience. After what felt like an eternity, the council chairman leaned forward. "Crow," he said slowly, "you speak with conviction, but how do we know you are right? How can we trust this wisdom you claim?" Elias reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle of herbs and rocks, carefully arranged. "Observe these," he said. "They are connected to the land. If we disturb the canyon carelessly, these and more will be affected. I have seen it with my own eyes. I have watched the land's response to carelessness. I am asking you to act before it is too late." The room was quiet. Some members exchanged glances, realizing that the mountain man's words were not empty threats, but genuine concern. Others still doubted, but a seed of curiosity had been planted. The council decided to take preliminary steps. They would restrict access to the grove temporarily and send a few men to observe the area with Elias. It was not a full victory, but it was a beginning. Elias felt a quiet relief, knowing that he had made progress. The sacred grove was not entirely safe yet, but awareness had been raised, and that was the first step. Leaving the council hall, Elias walked through the town streets. The air felt heavier, charged with both curiosity and doubt. He passed the men who had mocked him near the market. Their expressions were unreadable, but he noticed hesitation in their steps. They had heard his words, and something had shifted, even if only slightly. That evening, he returned to the canyon. The woman was waiting by the stream, her eyes calm as ever. Elias approached her, removing his hat once again. "I spoke to the council," he said quietly. "They will take steps to protect the grove, at least for now." The woman studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "You have begun to understand," she said. "The land is patient, but it tests those who claim to care for it. You have passed a small test today, but the journey is only beginning." Elias felt a mixture of pride and humility. He knew that he had acted out of respect and caution, yet he also understood that this was only one step in a much longer path. Protecting the sacred grove would require constant vigilance, careful guidance, and the willingness to face opposition. The woman returned to her work, gathering herbs and tending to the small animals that moved quietly near the stream. Elias watched for a moment, reflecting on the lessons he had learned. Patience, observation, and respect were more than words. They were actions, and they were necessary if he hoped to honor the land and the woman's teachings. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Elias felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The mountains were no longer just a place to survive. They were a place to protect, to learn from, and to respect. And though challenges awaited him, he was ready to face them, armed with knowledge, humility, and the quiet guidance of someone who had lived in harmony with the land for generations. For the first time in his life, Elias understood that true strength did not come from power or skill alone. It came from respect, patience, and the courage to act when it was needed most. And as he settled near the fire that night, listening to the soft whisper of the wind and the distant call of an owl, he knew that the real work was just beginning. The sacred grove would survive, but only if he and the town learned to honor it. And Elias, once a solitary mountain man, had found a new role, not just as a survivor but as a guardian, a messenger, and a bridge between worlds. The next few days in the town were unusually quiet. Elias sensed a strange tension in the air as he walked past the market and the small shops. Some townsfolk had begun to whisper about the canyon, the sacred grove, and the warnings he had shared. Others, however, scoffed quietly, dismissing his words as superstition. Elias knew that not everyone would understand at once, but he had seen enough to know that the land's patience was not endless. That afternoon he decided to return to the canyon. He needed to check the sacred grove himself to see if anyone had ignored the boundaries or caused harm despite the council's orders. The sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky paths, and the air was still, heavy with the scent of sage and warm earth. As he approached the grove, his heart sank. The ground near the entrance was disturbed. Stones were shifted, small plants trampled, and traces of human presence marked the once pristine area. Elias recognized the work immediately. It was the men from town, careless and curious, ignoring the warnings. He crouched to examine the ground more closely, noticing small tools left behind, broken branches and footprints that led deeper into the grove. He knew the warnings had been clear. The grove was protected for a reason. The balance of life here was delicate. Every plant, every stone, every stream played a role. Disturbing even a small part could have consequences far beyond what anyone could predict. Elias felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Suddenly, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the trees. He looked up just in time to see a small landslide begin, triggered by the careless digging and movement of the intruders. Rocks tumbled down the slope, dislodging soil and smashing small plants in their path. Elias reacted quickly, jumping aside and pulling a small sapling to block the path of a falling branch. He watched in horror as the land itself seemed to respond, a reminder of the woman's words, "The land remembers, and it will respond." He had seen small disturbances before, but nothing like this. The landslide, though not large enough to harm anyone seriously, was a warning, a signal from the canyon that its balance had been disrupted. Elias understood now that the sacred grove's protection was not just tradition, it was survival. As he helped clear some of the debris, Elias noticed the small stream near the grove had begun to shift its course slightly. Water that had flowed steadily now pooled in irregular patterns, and some plants that depended on its flow were wilting. It was a subtle change, but to Elias, it was significant. The land was not forgiving of carelessness. He felt a pang of guilt. If he had not left the grove unattended for even a moment, perhaps the damage could have been prevented. He spent the rest of the afternoon carefully repairing what he could. Stones were repositioned, plants supported, and small channels cleared to restore the flow of water. Though it was a small effort, he felt a connection to the land deepen. Each action was deliberate, thoughtful, and respectful, a stark contrast to the careless movements of those who had trespassed. As the sun began to set, Elias sat quietly near the stream, reflecting on the events of the day. The canyon was alive in a way that few people could understand. It responded to carelessness, remembered every step, and demanded respect. He thought of the woman who had warned him long ago. "Some things are not for everyone," she had said. "If disturbed, they bring harm." Now he understood fully. The warning was not a superstition. It was a lesson in balance, patience, and responsibility. Elias knew he could not repair all the damage alone. The grove was too large, and the town's disregard had already begun to alter its delicate balance. He realized he would need allies, people who understood the importance of protecting the land. But how could he convince those who still saw it as just rocks and trees? That evening he returned to his cabin, exhausted but determined. He gathered his notes, maps, and observations, preparing to speak to the council again. He needed to show them what had happened, to make them see the consequences of ignoring the sacred grove. The mountains had given him lessons, but the town needed proof to understand. The next morning, Elias returned to the council hall, carrying samples of disturbed soil, broken branches, and photographs of the affected areas. He spoke with urgency, describing the landslide, the shifted streams, and the subtle changes in the grove. He explained how each small disturbance affected the larger ecosystem, connecting the dots between human carelessness and the land's response. Some council members listened carefully, nodding as they understood for the first time. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to accept that the canyon had a memory or that the sacred grove held any real power. But Elias did not waver. He spoke with calm authority, sharing the lessons he had learned from observation, patience, and respect. By the end of the meeting, a plan was agreed upon. The council decided to place stricter protections around the grove, limiting access to only those who were trained and respectful. Signs were posted, and a small group of townsfolk, including Elias, were tasked with monitoring the area. Though some remained skeptical, the grove would now have guardians, and the land itself seemed to settle as if approving the decision. Elias returned to the canyon that afternoon, greeted by the familiar sight of the woman. She had been tending to the grove, her movements calm and precise despite the recent disturbances. When she saw him, she smiled faintly, a quiet acknowledgement of his efforts. "You have learned more than I expected," she said softly. "The land tests all who enter. Today it showed you its response. Tomorrow you must continue to protect it." Elias nodded. "I understand now," he said. "The sacred grove is not just a place, it is a responsibility, and I will do everything I can to protect it." The woman studied him for a long moment, her eyes reflecting the fading sunlight. "Respect is not given once and forgotten," she said. "It must be earned and maintained every day. The land will judge your actions, and so will your heart." As Elias watched her return to her work, he felt a sense of purpose stronger than he had ever known. The mountains were no longer just a home. They were a teacher, a guide, and a test. The sacred grove had shown him that true respect required action, vigilance, and humility. It was not enough to speak of protection or understanding. He had to live it every day. Night fell over the canyon, and the stars began to shine, reflecting in the clear waters of the stream. Elias sat quietly, listening to the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. He understood now that the sacred grove was more than a warning. It was a reminder of the delicate balance of life, the importance of humility, and the need to honor the past while protecting the future. And though challenges still awaited, Elias felt ready. The canyon had tested him, the land had responded, and he had begun to understand the weight of the responsibility placed upon him. The sacred grove would survive, not just because of rules or warnings, but because of the respect, care, and vigilance of those who truly understood its value. As he closed his eyes that night, Elias realized something profound. The mountain, the grove, and the woman's teachings had shown him that life was not about conquering or controlling. It was about observing, understanding, and acting with care. The canyon had given him a gift, a lesson in respect and responsibility that would guide him for the rest of his life. And somewhere in the quiet of the sacred grove, the land waited, patient and enduring, ready to respond to the next lesson, the next action, and the next moment of care. The following morning, the canyon was quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. Elias walked along the familiar paths, the sunlight spilling over the rocks and trees, reflecting off the small streams. The events of the past weeks weighed heavily on his mind, but he felt a strange sense of calm. The sacred grove had been disturbed, Lessons had been learned, and the town had begun to understand its importance. Yet, he knew the true challenge had only just begun. Respect and vigilance could not be achieved in a single day. They required daily commitment. As he approached the grove, he saw her, Ahioka, the Apache woman who had first warned him. She was kneeling beside the stream, arranging small stones and herbs with her usual care. When she saw him, she looked up and gave a small nod, acknowledging his presence without a word. Elias returned her nod, feeling a quiet gratitude for the lesson she had taught him. Her guidance had not only changed the way he saw the canyon, but also the way he saw himself. "The grove is safer now," Elias said softly, breaking the silence. "The council has placed restrictions. They are monitoring it, and some townspeople are learning to respect it. Safety is not given," she said. "It is earned. You have learned to act, to protect, and to understand the consequences of carelessness. But others must also learn. The land will remind them if they forget." Elias looked around, taking in the grove in its quiet beauty. The small trees swayed gently in the breeze, the stream sparkled in the sunlight, and birds flitted through the branches. Life seemed to pulse in a rhythm that only those who truly watched could feel. He realized that protecting the grove was not just about stopping harm. It was about maintaining a balance, a harmony between people and nature. Over the next few weeks, Elias took on a new role in the town. He became a guide for those who wished to enter the canyon, teaching them to move carefully, observe quietly, and respect the land. Some were skeptical at first, but seeing the changes in the grove and the subtle signs of its fragility, they began to listen. They learned how to gather herbs without harming other plants, how to notice changes in the water and soil, and how to understand the delicate balance of life that existed in every corner of the canyon. The town began to change in small ways. Fences were built around the most sensitive areas. Warning signs were posted, and local children were taught to observe the land respectfully. Farmers adjusted their grazing patterns to protect streams and plant life, and hunters learned to track animals without disturbing their habitats. Slowly, the canyon's balance began to recover, as if the land itself acknowledged the effort being made. One afternoon, as Elias walked through the grove, he saw a small group of townspeople observing the streams and plants. They were careful, quiet, and attentive, asking questions and taking notes. He realized that the lessons he had learned from Ahioka were beginning to spread. Respect was no longer just his personal responsibility. It was becoming a shared value in the community. Ahioka appeared beside him without a sound. "You have done well," she said softly. "The land responds to those who act with care. You have become a bridge between two worlds, the town and the canyon. But remember, this work is ongoing. Respect must be renewed every day." Elias nodded, understanding the depth of her words. He had come to the canyon seeking knowledge, but he had gained something much greater: purpose. Protecting the sacred grove was no longer an obligation imposed by the woman. It was a commitment he had embraced for himself and for everyone who would come after. As evening approached, Elias stood at the edge of the grove, watching the sunlight fade behind the mountains. The colors in the sky mirrored the changes within him, shades of orange and pink giving way to deep purples and blues, a reminder that every day was a new beginning. He thought about the men who had once mocked him, the council members who had doubted him, and the townsfolk who had ignored the warnings. Some had learned, some still had much to learn. But the first steps had been taken, and that was enough to give hope. That night, he returned to his cabin, feeling a quiet sense of fulfillment. He lit a small fire, watching the flames dance and listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. He thought about Ahioka, about the sacred grove, and about the lessons the canyon had taught him. Every moment in the wilderness, every careful step he had taken, had led him to this understanding. True respect required patience, observation, and action. In the days that followed, Elias continued his work, guiding townsfolk, monitoring the grove, and learning from the land. The canyon became a living classroom where lessons were taught not just through words, but through careful attention and mindful action. People began to tell stories about the sacred grove, stories that emphasized respect, humility, and the importance of listening to the land. The town, once dismissive of the mountains and their secrets, began to change in subtle but meaningful ways. Farmers, hunters, and travelers alike started to understand that the canyon was more than just a backdrop for their lives. It was a partner, a teacher, and a source of life that required care and respect. And in that quiet transformation, Elias saw the true impact of his efforts. One morning, as he walked along the canyon's edge, Elias paused to watch the sunrise. The light spilled over the peaks, illuminating the sacred grove in a warm glow. He saw Ayoka tending to the herbs, her movements calm and deliberate, and he felt a sense of connection that went beyond words. They had not spoken much in recent days, but a quiet understanding passed between them, a shared recognition of the work done and the work still to come.
"You have done well, Elias," she said softly, appearing beside him.
The land has accepted your efforts, and the town is beginning to understand. But never forget, respect is ongoing. The sacred grove will continue to teach, and those who listen will continue to learn. Elias nodded, feeling the truth in her words. "I understand," he said. "I will continue to protect it, to teach others, and to learn myself. The grove has shown me the meaning of responsibility, patience, and care. I will not forget." As he walked back toward his cabin, Elias felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The mountains, the canyon, and the sacred grove were no longer just places to survive. They were living lessons, guiding him, shaping him, and connecting him to something far greater than himself. In the days, months, and years that followed, the town and the canyon grew closer, connected by understanding and respect. The sacred grove remained protected, a symbol of balance and harmony. And Elias, once a solitary mountain man, became a quiet guardian, a teacher, and a bridge between worlds. He never forgot the first warning that Ayoka had whispered. "That is forbidden." But now he understood fully. The words were not a warning against curiosity. They were an invitation to learn, to respect, and to act with care. And as the sun set over the canyon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and purple, Elias stood at the edge of the sacred grove, watching the land he had learned to love. He realized that the canyon's lessons would continue, guiding not just him, but everyone who took the time to listen. In the quiet of the mountains, the streams, and the trees, the story of respect and care continued, as enduring and alive as the land itself.